Welcome to Suzanne's studio. I'm Suzanne Barnett, your host, and tonight I am so honored and pleased to introduce my guest, Dr. Alan H.B. Wu, the highly esteemed, internationally known in the field of chemistry, clinical chemistry, toxicology, cardiac biomarkers, and
pharmacogenomics.
Pharmacogenomics. Not good on my part, but wonderful on your part. I'm so pleased that you are here, Alan. May I call you Alan?
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me to be on your show again.
Again,
it's quite a thrill to be with you today.
Oh, you're so nice. And what we're going to talk about is so absolutely important. And I'm so glad that you're really here to talk about it, which is, go ahead.
Today,
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about my new book. It's entitled Performance Enhancing Drugs and Other Adulterants. It's a sequel to one of my other books, but this time I'm talking about PEDs. PEDs are drugs that are abused by athletes in order to better themselves, and these have caused a lot of misery for themselves and for families, and it's a message that I'm trying to send.
But this is now your fourth book, right?
Yes.
The other three books were pertaining to other things, which I think are so fascinating. Just to give the audience a little bit, tell us about the other three.
Well, my first book was on medical and clinical toxicology. It was a description of real medical cases involving poisoned patients. The second book was called The Hidden Assassin, When Clinical Laboratory Tests Go Awry. It's about stories involving the clinical laboratory, the role that we play in making diagnoses and helping doctors decide what therapies to use. And sometimes bad things happen because the tests were either performed wrong or the interpretations were incorrect, or there may have been faulty devices involved. My third book is on microbiology. You know, Suzanne, we're exposed to microorganisms everywhere you turn. And for most of us, it's not a problem because we have natural immunity. But if you get older or if you get infected in places that you're not accustomed to, then these microorganisms can definitely cause havoc and death. And I talk about how microorganisms can be both your friend and your enemy at the same time. So those are my first three books.
Well, we're going to have you on all the time. You have so much information. But now you're crazy about this new book.
Yes, so this latest book is a little bit of a departure from my first three, which I talk about really more medical practices and things that everyday people like yourself and like me will encounter as they enter a need for medical care. In this book, I talk about really more things that celebrities do and sports figures, politicians, things that they do onto themselves in order to try to get an advancement. And these are things that have led many people to have bad outcomes.
So tell us, why are you so interested in this subject right now?
Well, I have multiple interests. First of all, I am a sportsman. I've participated in many of the sports that I talk about. I'm also a big fan of the professional sports, whether it be football or hockey or golf or tennis, basketball. And what I see in these professional sports is a shifting of talent from one that is naturally acquired, and I have a lot of confidence that most of the athletes that we encounter today are naturally gifted, but unfortunately there's a handful of them who are artificially enhanced, artificially given or taking performance-enhancing drugs that make it a little bit more unnatural. And what people don't, I think, recognize is the consequences of taking these PEDs. And so these are kinds of the stories that I describe so that people can understand what they're getting into if they choose to use PEDs.
But tell why it's so important that the public knows about this because of their own children.
Well, that is really the major mission, is that we look at our sports heroes and actors and actresses as our role models. And we want to be like them. We want to be glamorous. We want to be athletic. We want to have good-looking bodies. We want to be able to perform. The adulation of fans is something that kids strive for. And when it's unnaturally acquired, this becomes the problem, that these athletes are subjecting themselves to lifetime medical risks that I think that if they knew from the beginning that they would not do that. And I'm hoping that our children don't think that that is okay to do and gravitate towards using these PEDs in order to enhance their own performance, or even just a simple enhance their own image. We don't need these artificial means to look better.
But Alan, why would the doctors give these drugs to these athletes? Why would they do that?
Well, most doctors would not. They would see the dangers of using these medications and would never do that on a willing basis. But like any profession, there are individuals who are paid very well and have licenses to dispense drugs and chemicals, and they do so for profit.
So they're not very good doctors, really. I mean, they don't have a conscience, right?
Well, it's not just doctors. Doctors will certainly be the ones that order some of the drugs and some of the hormones. But some of the stories that I tell involve chemical substances that can be synthesized by clandestine garage-type laboratories and sold on the black market without a doctor's prescription. There's really no medical reason for these people to be on these compounds, and so it's done secretly.
Well, because of your profession, do you think that you're more knowledgeable about these problems than most doctors like you?
Well, since I run a clinical laboratory, both a chemistry and toxicology laboratory, it is my job to do testing for many of the hormones and drugs that are described in my stories. They do have sometimes legitimate medical uses, but when they're used in a different context than or to a very high extent, that's when bad things happen.
Could you tell us a story? Of course, the stories in your books, I have a whole library now, thanks to you. But tell us a story if you can. Because your book, by the way, congratulations. Today is the the publication of this book.
Yes, today, as with the last time we met, was the publication of my third book. It coincided with our interview. So the chemicals that I'm talking about are ones that are in the news all the time. You can go onto the internet and buy testosterone to increase your virility, increase your muscle strength. Steroids has become rampant amongst many of our athletes, particularly those who want to build bigger bodies or perhaps run faster or hit a baseball further. We also have abuse of doping. Doping refers to giving yourself a blood transfusion. And blood transfusions of younger blood allow you to exercise longer, really helpful for endurance sports like long distance running or swimming or bicycling.
What do these drugs do to the person?
Well, the effects are variable.
That's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, some of them develop, some of them when taken in excess can end up developing cancer down the road.
Really?
Others will suppress your natural hormone system, which then goes out of whack. You end up with acne or secondary characteristics that by themselves are not dangerous, but is a sign that your child or your loved one is doing something unnatural.
What about those football players that beat up their wives or girlfriends?
Well, so this is part of the dangers that we have,
Yeah.
is that we hear almost every week now an athlete who has been accused of domestic violence, violence against their spouse or girlfriend, and many of them are on a performance-enhancing drug, whether it be a steroid or a testosterone or some type of medication that makes them more aggressive, makes them be stronger than they need to be, and they sometimes take it out on their spouses. And this is some of the dangers, not only for the athletes themselves, but for the people that are around them, their family, their loved ones.
And you think that without these drugs, these people would not have done that?
Well, what I strive for, and I think what many people strive for, is a level playing field, that we want our athletes to be able to perform according to their natural ability. And what happens is that this use of PEDs upsets that balance, and we have people who are overly skilled because of these drugs, and that prompts other people to follow suit in order to compete, in order to even exist in that environment. So it becomes a vicious cycle that you can't get out of it unless somebody says, we're going to stop this practice altogether. And that has begun. We now have rules, the Olympic Committee, the National Football League, Major League Baseball, they all have rules that have been enacted in just the last few years against PEDs. Despite that, we continue to see many people abusing these drugs. They get suspended, they come back after a few months, and it all starts all over again.
And I assume that you feel so strongly about this that you wrote the book, and you give speeches all over the world. You've given speeches everywhere, not just on this, but in your illustrious career.
Well, my intent is not to change rules. I'm not in that position of authority to enact rules that ban the use of PEDs. My objective is to make sure that people understand the medical and psychological consequences of taking these drugs, of the effect that it might have on families, as I indicated. And it actually goes a little bit bigger than that. I think that it comes down to a matter of family values as well, that many of our athletes are looked upon as heroes to our children because they can hit a baseball or because they can run for a touchdown, and that's wrong too. I think that in my stories, I try to show a side that is more real, that these are people who get into trouble and are not our role models. Our role models should be our parents and our loved ones, people who are normal, who don't take these medications, who do go about their everyday jobs and work successfully and have no idea of some of the things that these other people get into.
Now, your stories are all true. You changed the names. Is that true?
This particular book are not based on cases that I have been involved with, unlike the first three books, because I don't treat athletes. I'm not a trainer. I'm not involved with professional sports. I am involved with the drugs and the hormones and the chemicals that they use. My stories are concocted literally from the headlines, from famous people who have been identified as having used performance-enhancing drugs. I have fictionalized them so that it can be more generic, but I don't need to tell you the names of these people. They're in the headlines almost every day.
And so you are really a huge part of this. And again, how can people be, families, especially with children, how can they be educated to this if they don't read your book?
Well, they need to talk. They need to have family meetings. When my children were young, I insisted that we all sat down to eat dinner every night. And these are the times when you can talk about that. You can ask them, what do you think of this athlete who has gotten involved with this drug, or this incident where somebody struck down a spouse, an act of domestic violence, and what causes these things, and how does it happen? And I think that nobody believes that this is a good thing, but if you don't talk about it, then it becomes sort of a hidden assassin. And this is part of the reason that I entitled the second book, The Hidden Assassin, because it is behind the scenes. These drugs are not what they appear to be.
Yeah. Just for a moment, let me ask you. First of all, when do you have time to write? With your profession and your expertise, you're all over the world, literally. How do you do that?
Well, obviously it's a passion of mine. For the first 30 years of my career, I concentrated on medical science and laboratory science. And I wanted to know, I wanted to learn, and I lectured to my colleagues one-on-one or one-on-many on my science. Now that I'm toward the end of my career, I'm more interested in promoting my clinical science, not to my colleagues because they already know the value of clinical laboratory testing. It's to the public, because I think that the public needs to understand the valuable role that clinical lab science plays in their day-to-day medical care.
Yeah. But this is quite a departure for you, isn't it?
It is and it isn't. I believe that the science part of these stories are very consistent with the things that I wrote in the first 3 books. But I'm hoping to strike a nerve with the stories because everybody will recognize who I'm talking about in these stories, even though I don't have any direct relationship to the characters in the real story. They may be able to think, well, gee, maybe that's what it was like for them. Maybe that's how it happened, because I don't really know how it happened. I'm fictionalizing these stories, but I'm trying to make it more entertaining and at the same time educational.
It's a good version of the National Enquirer.
Well,
I'm just being facetious. You know that.
I certainly don't want to seek headlines.
But this yours though, it's at least scientific. The National Enquirer, you know, who knows? It's sure fun to read.
So you asked me when do I have time to do these things?
Yeah.
I do enjoy writing. The science part of these stories write themselves, because this is the science that I have worked and lived for the better part of my career. And so the building of characters and telling a story is the fun part, is trying to create something from a baseline of science.
And it's all accurate. It's all for real.
Well, I do a lot of investigation on the science to ensure that the information I provide is accurate, but the characters have to be changed in order to protect their identities.
Yeah. How long have you been in your field? How many years?
35.
35. How important is it for you?
How important
what you
is
do?
What I'm doing now or what I did before?
The whole thing.
Well, there was no question that in building my career, it was important because I felt that I made an impact on how healthcare is delivered, particularly for the laboratory science. But you know, research studies and grants and discoveries are short-lived. That there's always somebody that comes along with the next best test or a new theory, and certainly they might build on the concepts that I raise, but nobody reads papers from 5 or 10 years ago, except for historic purposes. I'm hoping that these books will become sort of classics that people will read many years from now because they're still going to be relevant. The laboratory tests that we're doing are still going to be relevant. We're not talking cutting edge here. We're talking entertainment. We're saying that these are everyday types of substances and drugs and tests that are available, but I'm trying to show how they are being used in a bad way.
How did you come up with the idea of these books?
Well, it's it's based on case reports that I've written that have been published, but case reports are directed from one scientist or one doctor to another, and there's never a story attached to it. And so after a while, it just became to me more information, more knowledge that's being disseminated to ourselves, to the other people in my profession. And then that was when I thought I needed to do something more. I needed to leave a mark on the future generation of people going into the science, because I believe that budget cuts are going to prohibit us from continuing along this line.
You mentioned that. That sounds very bleak. What are we going to do?
Well, Suzanne, right now, about 20% of the U.S. gross domestic product is spent on healthcare. That's up from just 5% when I started in my career. It's gone up fourfold in just 35 years. We're double that of any other Western country, whether it be Canada or Australia or the UK. We cannot continue to spend that rate of dollars, despite the fact that the average age of the public is getting older, and we're going to need more, not less, medical care. And so when it comes time to cut budgets, I believe that the disciplines that are most glamorous, that people know about, that might be surgery or women's health or cancer, are going to be maintained. And the professions like the clinical laboratory, which tends to be behind the scenes, which tends to not get the kind of notoriety or glory, will be the victims, that they will be cut to the point where we're not going to be able to do the kinds of investigations that we are enjoying today, the kind of research as well as the clinical practices that we have.
I don't like to hear that. I really don't.
Well, I don't either, because I'm entering that generation where I'm going to demand the kinds of medical care that my lab has provided over the last 30 years. And when it comes time for me wanting it, I don't want it to be taken away, especially since I'm a knowledgeable consumer and I know exactly the value. If somebody who doesn't know the value, hasn't read my books, hasn't really paid attention, those are the people that are going to be hurt.
I hate to end this wonderful show on that note. Can't you say something positive?
Well, it's always been my hypothesis that people remember bad things a little bit more than good things. And so my stories are difficult to read. Most of the people who I create either die or they cause harm to somebody else, because it's my intent for people to remember that, to say, gee, I hope that doesn't happen to me, or let's make sure that we take steps so it doesn't happen to me. So I actually don't have a lot of good things to say about my stories, other than I think that they're entertaining.
Well, you certainly have been a wonderful guest. This is the second time on. And when I have a really hot guest like you, gotta come back, because there's so many things that we need to talk about. Really. I thank you so much, Alan, for being on the show.
Well,
I really
Suzanne,
do.
it's my pleasure to be on the show, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. You too. And do we have any more time? Oh, we have 2 minutes. Okay, I have a very important question I'm hoping that I could get to. And that is, wait a second. Oh, what has been your greatest accomplishment in life? 2 minutes.
Well, I don't need 2 minutes. That's a no-brainer.
Yeah,
It's my family.
yeah,
It's my wife and my children
Yeah.
and my parents
Yeah.
and my brothers and their families. Those are my greatest accomplishments. This is why I do anything that I do.
but also professionally speaking.
Well, professionally, it's the mission that I'm on now. It's the ride that I'm currently taking, that I'm reaching out to the public
Yeah.
and trying to make them understand why it's important that the medical tests that we perform continue.
But you're one person. How can we get more people like you to give this message?
Well, I lecture as much to lay public as to my own colleagues. I don't try to teach them the value of laboratory testing. As I said earlier, they already know that. Instead, I try to motivate them to get themselves involved so that when they see people and meet people, they can try to begin to tell them why what they do is so important. It's been very difficult because most people in my profession aren't the kinds of people who like to boast about themselves. They're not ones to tell tall tales. They're there to do honest day work. They know that they provide valuable information, and they just want to go home and be with their families. And I think that this has got to change. That I think that we need grassroots support from the people in my profession to get out there like I have and tell these stories.
You have said it. It's been a wonderful show, and I thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. And of course, I'm just so crazy about our crew. They are talented and disciplined, and they've been, with me for so long. I really appreciate it. And KMVT is the best station around. And of course, one more thing, I want to thank my audience for watching. And you know what? I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.